Seat 14A was nothing special. It was a window seat on a mid-size commercial jet, cramped between a scuffed plastic wall and a fold-down tray table, with a coffee ring someone had never wiped away. The woman who sat there had boarded early, stowed a single gray duffel bag overhead, and settled in with a paperback so worn its spine had gone soft and pale, like a bone left out in the sun. She was somewhere in her late 50s, though she could have passed for older or younger depending on the light. Her hair was cut short and practical, more silver than brown now. Her hands were steady in a way that made the flight attendants glance at her twice without knowing why. She wore a plain gray sweater, jeans, and boots that had clearly walked more miles than any of the other 211 passengers on the aircraft combined. Her name, according to the manifest, was Elena Voss. Nothing about the manifest said anything else. No frequent flyer status. No special meal request. No emergency contact on file that anyone could easily find. She had paid for her ticket in cash 3 days earlier at a counter in a regional airport most people had never heard of, and she had not spoken to another passenger since she sat down. She had chosen this particular flight for reasons that had nothing to do with convenience. The route happened to pass near restricted airspace that had once a lifetime ago belonged to a squadron she had commanded, a fact that meant nothing to the airline's scheduling algorithm, and everything to a woman who still, after all these years, felt a small pull in her chest whenever her travels carried her anywhere near the old training corridors. She was not the sort of person who believed in fate, exactly. She had spent too many years relying on instruments and probabilities to put much stock in anything as unreliable as fate. But she believed, in a quieter and more practical way, that certain parts of a life keep circling back toward each other whether a person plans for it or not. The way weather systems will sometimes return to the same stretch of coastline year after year, pulled by forces too large to notice from the ground. She had boarded that morning the way she boarded every flight, early, unhurried, with a single duffel bag containing exactly what she needed and nothing she didn't. The paperback had been a gift from a former student, a young woman who had gone on to fly cargo routes across the Pacific, and who still, every few months, mailed Elena a book with a handwritten note tucked into the front cover. This one had simply said, "Thought of you." Something about lighthouses and people who wait. Elena had smiled at the note, tucked it into the back pages where she kept the others, and started reading somewhere over a state she had lost track of the name of. She was reading, or appeared to be reading, a novel about a lighthouse keeper on the coast of Maine. She had read the same page for the last 11 minutes. Her eyes moved across the words, but her attention had gone somewhere else, somewhere with the low hum of jet engines that reminded her of another kind of sky. 2 rows up and across the aisle, a young father tried to keep his son quiet with a tablet loaded with cartoons. Behind her, a businesswoman typed rapid-fire on a laptop, drafting an email she would delete before landing. Nobody on the plane had any reason to look twice at the quiet woman in 14A. That was, in fact, exactly how she preferred it. The flight had been ordinary for the first 40 minutes. Then the seatbelt sign chimed on without warning, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, a little too smooth, a little too rehearsed, the way pilots sound when they are trying very hard not to alarm 200 people who are all, at that exact moment, 6 miles above solid ground. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We've had a routine flight path adjustment requested by air traffic control. Please make sure your seatbelts are securely fastened. We'll have you back on course shortly." It was not routine. Elena knew that before the captain finished the sentence. She had spent enough years listening to voices trying to sound calm over an intercom to recognize the particular strain in this one. The extra half-second pause before the word routine. The way shortly came out slightly too fast. She set the paperback face down on her knee, not because she needed to, but because some old habit told her hands to be ready. Outside her window, the sky was a flat, hard blue, the kind of blue you only see at cruising altitude, where the air is too thin to hold color the way it does closer to the ground. For a moment, nothing changed. Then something did. A shape appeared off the left wing, low and fast, cutting a clean line through the empty air. Then another, mirroring the first on the right side of the plane, close enough that passengers pressed their faces to the windows and gasped. phones rising like a wave of small black rectangles. Fighter jets. Two of them, matte gray against the blue, engines throwing off heat that shimmered the air behind them. They did not look like an accident. They looked like they had been sent. The cabin, which had been a low murmur of chatter and clinking ice, went very quiet, and then very loud, all at once. A child began to cry. Someone near the front asked, too loudly, if they were being hijacked. A flight attendant moved briskly down the aisle, her professional smile cracking slightly at the corners, repeating the same reassurance, in the same measured tone, to row after row. Everything is fine, folks, please stay seated, everything is fine. Elena Voss did not press her face to the window like everyone else. She did not need to. She recognized the tail markings before the jets had even finished settling into formation. She recognized the wing shape, the paint scheme, the particular arrogance of the flight pattern. Tight, disciplined, practiced 1,000 times in training and a handful of times for real. She had flown that exact silhouette herself a long time ago, in a different life, under a different name that almost nobody alive still used. She watched the jets take up position, one off each wing, flying close enough that she could make out the shapes of helmets inside the cockpits, faceless behind tinted visors. And for the first time since she had boarded this flight, Elena Voss allowed herself the smallest, most private smile. Well, she murmured to no one, to the worn paperback, to the window, to the two jets holding formation off her wingtips, like ghosts she had once commanded. There you are. Around her, the cabin had settled into the particular kind of fear that comes with not understanding what is happening. A man across the aisle gripped his armrest so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Two college-age girls in matching sweatshirts held hands over the empty middle seat between them, phones forgotten in their laps for the first time in the entire flight. The businesswoman behind Elena had stopped typing altogether and sat with her laptop closed, staring at the seat back in front of her as though it might offer some explanation the captain hadn't. A flight attendant named Priya moved down the aisle with a drink cart nobody wanted, using the routine of service as a way to check on people without alarming them further. She paused beside Elena's row, more out of habit than need, and noticed something odd. The quiet woman in 14A was the only passenger on the entire aircraft who did not look afraid. She looked, if anything, like someone watching an old photograph slowly develop, waiting to see whose face would appear. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" Priya asked, mostly on reflex. "No, thank you," Elena said. "I'm fine." Priya hesitated a moment longer, the way people sometimes hesitate around calm in the middle of chaos, unsure whether it is reassuring or unsettling. She decided, without quite deciding to decide, that it was reassuring, and moved on down the aisle with slightly steadier hands than she'd had a minute before. Elena watched her go, then turned back to the window. The jets had not moved. They held their position with a precision that spoke of hours upon hours of formation training, the kind of discipline that could not be faked or improvised. She found herself counting the seconds between minor adjustments in their spacing, an old habit surfacing before she had consciously decided to let it. 3 seconds. 4. The rhythm of it was as familiar to her as her own pulse. She thought briefly of turning to the stranger beside her, an older man with reading glasses pushed up into thinning hair, gripping a rosary he had produced sometime in the last few minutes, and telling him that whatever was happening outside the window was not the threat he thought it was. She decided against it. There was no way to explain, in the time available, in words a stranger would believe, that the two aircraft flying dangerously close to a commercial jet were not a danger at all, but something closer to an old debt finally circling back to be paid. Instead, she sat with her hands folded over the closed paperback, and she waited, the way she had learned to wait a long time ago, in cockpits and hearing rooms, and the long gray years in between, patiently, and without any outward sign of how much the waiting cost her. In the cockpit of the lead fighter jet, call sign Hawk 1, Major Marcus Reyes kept his hands steady on the controls and his voice steadier on the radio, even though something about this assignment had felt wrong from the moment the scramble order came through. Unidentified aircraft entering restricted corridor Bravo 7, the controller had said. Possible threat to commercial traffic. Intercept and escort authorization Whiskey 6. It should have been simple. An unresponsive aircraft had drifted into restricted airspace, close enough to the flight path of a commercial jet that command wanted eyes on both, wanted the situation contained before anyone on the ground had to make a harder decision. Marcus and his wingman, Captain Daniel Cho, callsign Reese, had been airborne within 11 minutes, climbing hard, running the intercept exactly the way they had trained to run it 100 times before. The unidentified aircraft, it turned out, was nothing dramatic. A small private plane with a dead radio and a rattled pilot who had wandered off course and would be escorted safely back to controlled airspace by a different flight. That threat resolved itself within minutes. What did not resolve was the second half of the order, the part that had made Marcus's jaw tighten the moment it came through his headset. Hawk Flight. Maintain escort on commercial flight 2291. Command wants close formation, priority handling on landing. Repeat, priority handling. Priority handling was not a phrase you used for a routine escort. Priority handling meant someone above his pay grade had flagged this flight for reasons nobody had bothered to explain to the two pilots actually flying beside it. Reese, you copy that last transmission? Marcus said over their private channel. Copy, Daniel answered, his voice flat, controlled. The way it always was in the air. No further explanation given. You think this is a security thing? Could be. Feels different though. Marcus eased his throttle, matching speed with the commercial jet, now sliding into formation off his right side. Through the canopy, he could see rows of pale ovals, passenger windows, faces pressed against the glass, phones raised. He had done dozens of escorts in his career. People always looked frightened. That part was normal. What was not normal was the tightness low in his chest, a feeling he had learned a long time ago not to ignore. He had felt it before combat missions, before difficult calls, before moments that would matter more than they seemed to in the instant they were happening. He felt it now, and he did not know why, and that bothered him more than the feeling itself. Command didn't say why this flight rate special treatment, Daniel said. You'd think if there was a real threat on board, they'd tell us. Maybe it's not a threat, Marcus said. Maybe it's the opposite. Daniel didn't answer right away. Through the small gap in formation, Marcus caught a glimpse of the commercial jet's fuselage. The neat rows of windows sliding past, ordinary and anonymous. 200 strangers heading somewhere on an ordinary day that had suddenly stopped being ordinary. Neither of the pilots knew in that moment that 3 rows from the front of coach, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a paperback about a lighthouse keeper was watching their formation with an expression neither of them would have recognized, because neither of them had ever seen her face. Not really. Not since they were young enough to still believe the sky belonged to people who deserved it. Marcus had joined the Air Force at 19, driven by a memory of watching jets tear low over his grandfather's farm as a boy, the sound of them rattling the windows of the old farmhouse in a way that had felt, to him, like the world announcing that something enormous was possible. He had wanted to fly since before he understood what flying actually cost. Daniel had come to it differently, through engineering, through a fascination with systems and precision, through a slow-building certainty that he wanted to be the kind of person who could be trusted with something that could kill him if he made even a small mistake. They had met in flight school, competitive in the easy way young men are competitive when they don't yet know what real stakes feel like, and they had been assigned, along with 4 other pilots, to a training squadron under a commander whose reputation preceded her into every room she entered. She was, by the time they joined her squadron, already something of a legend among younger pilots, not because of any single dramatic story, but because of 100 small ones, the accumulated weight of a career built on precision, discipline, and an almost unnerving calm under pressure. She did not coddle them. She did not, in the early weeks, seem to particularly like either of them. Marcus flew by instinct in a way that made her nervous. Daniel flew by the book in a way that made her equally nervous, for different reasons. She spent months grinding the rough edges off both of their habits, forcing Marcus to trust his instruments as much as his gut, forcing Daniel to trust his gut as much as his instruments, until the 2 young pilots, who had once seemed like opposite ends of a spectrum, had become, without either of them quite noticing, complementary halves of the same discipline. By the time the training exercise that would change all three of their lives began, Marcus and Daniel had come to think of their commander the way soldiers sometimes think of the people who train them hardest, with a complicated mixture of resentment, awe, and a loyalty neither of them would have been able to properly explain if asked. They did not call her by her given name. Almost nobody did. To the squadron, she was simply Viper 1. And the two junior pilots she had personally shaped through 9 grueling months of training had been assigned, jointly, a paired call sign of their own. Viper 2. It was meant originally as a simple designation, a way of identifying their two-ship element on the training schedule, nothing more. But by the end of those 9 months, it had come to mean something neither the paperwork nor the official record ever tried to capture. 2 young pilots, flying as one unit, under the direct command of a woman who had built them, quite literally, into the pilots capable of surviving what came next. Now 15 years later, holding formation off the wing of an ordinary commercial flight, Daniel found himself running through the same mental checklist he always ran through on a strange assignment: fuel state, formation spacing, communication protocol, and finding that none of it explained the low unease sitting in his stomach. He had learned over the years to trust that particular unease. It had saved him more than once, in situations far more dangerous than a routine escort with an unusually specific priority order attached. He glanced across the gap of open air separating his aircraft from Marcus's, close enough to see the outline of his wingman's helmet through the canopy, and thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that the two of them had ended up flying together still, all these years later, in different aircraft, different squadrons on paper, but somehow always finding their way back into formation with each other whenever the assignments allowed it. Neither of them had ever discussed it directly. It had simply happened again and again until it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like something neither of them wanted to examine too closely, for fear of jinxing it. "You still keep the old flight log?" Marcus asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the private channel without preamble, as though he'd been turning over the same unease Daniel had. "Which one?" Daniel asked, though he already knew which one Marcus meant. "The desert exercise. 15 years back." Daniel was quiet for a moment, adjusting his throttle to hold spacing as the commercial jet ahead of them made a minor course correction. "Yeah," he said finally. "I still have it. Don't know why. Never opens it much anymore." "I still have mine too," Marcus said. "Don't know why either." Neither of them said anything further about it, but something in the silence that followed felt different than the ordinary silence of a routine mission. Heavier, more deliberate, as though both men were circling the edges of a memory neither particularly wanted to name aloud over an open channel, even a private one. To understand why 2 of the country's most capable fighter pilots would eventually go silent over 6 simple words, it helps to go back 15 years, to a training range in the high desert where the air was dry enough to crack skin, and the exercises were supposed to be routine. Elena Voss had been a colonel then, though she went by a different name in the official records that still exist somewhere in a locked archive, a call sign earned over a decade of flying, a name that newer pilots said with a kind of reverence usually reserved for people already dead. She commanded a squadron of 6 aircraft running live-fire training exercises meant to simulate close air support in contested terrain. It was demanding work, dangerous even in training, the kind of flying where a half-second of hesitation could end a career or a life. 2 of the pilots under her command that season were young, talented, and dangerously overconfident in the particular way young, talented pilots often are. Marcus Reyes was 26, a natural stick and rudder flyer who trusted his instincts more than his instruments. Daniel Cho was 25, technically brilliant, meticulous, the kind of pilot who memorized every checklist, and sometimes forgot that checklist could not account for everything. On a clear morning in the 3rd week of the exercise, a coordination error during a live-fire run put both young pilots on a collision course with a ground target zone earlier than scheduled, seconds away from releasing ordnance onto a position where a maintenance crew had been mistakenly cleared to work. The error had started on the ground, in a scheduling mistake buried 3 layers deep in a communication chain that would take investigators months to fully untangle. But in the moment, all anyone could see was 2 young pilots, seconds from a catastrophic mistake. The morning had started the way every other morning of the exercise had started: a weather briefing, a scheduling review. Coffee gone lukewarm in metal thermoses, passed hand to hand across the ready room. Nobody in that room had any reason to suspect that a clerical adjustment made 2 days earlier by a scheduling office 3 time zones away had quietly shifted a maintenance window by 11 minutes, moving a ground crew into a target area precisely when Marcus and Daniel's flight was cleared to begin its live-fire run. Elena was airborne 20 minutes before the 2 younger pilots, flying a support pattern above and behind the exercise, close enough to monitor the range, but far enough back that she was not, technically, part of the strike package. She had a clear view of the telemetry feeding into her cockpit: altitude, heading, target coordinates, timing, numbers that individually meant nothing alarming. It was only in combination, only in the particular alignment of Marcus and Daniel's approach vector with the newly shifted maintenance window, that the numbers became something dangerous. She saw it 11 seconds before release. 11 seconds is not a long time. It is barely enough time to draw 2 full breaths. It was, that morning, exactly enough time for Elena Voss to do the only thing that could stop what was about to happen: break silence on 3 separate radio channels simultaneously, something her aircraft system was not designed to do smoothly, forcing a manual override that strained the transmitter and very nearly failed, and scream a single word with enough force that it cracked through every headset on the range at once: abort, abort, abort. Marcus, flying lead, felt his hands move before his mind had fully processed the command, some deeper layer of training overriding conscious thought. He hauled the stick back and to the side in a maneuver that strained the airframe and blacked the edges of his vision for a half second, ordnance release canceling automatically as his flight path broke from its programmed line. Daniel, a half second behind him, saw Marcus break formation and match the maneuver on pure reflex, trusting his wingman's instincts in the one instant where there was no time left to trust anything else. Below them, on the ground, a maintenance crew that had wandered 11 minutes early into a target zone they should never have entered watched 2 fighter jets scream past close enough to feel the heat of their engines, ordnance unreleased, a catastrophe reduced, in the space of 11 seconds, to nothing more than a very bad scare. Nobody on the ground was hurt. By every measure that mattered, it was a save, the kind of split-second decision that gets written up in training manuals as an example of exactly what a commander should do. Except the investigation that followed did not see it that way, not entirely. Elena's abort order, urgent and unauthorized, had itself violated protocol in ways that made it easier for people higher up the chain to build a simpler story than the true one. The true story was messy: a scheduling failure, a communication breakdown. 2 young pilots who had followed their orders exactly as given. The simpler story needed a single point of failure, someone whose judgment could be questioned, whose career could absorb the consequences, so that the deeper, more complicated failures never had to be examined in daylight. Elena was offered that story, and she took it. The hearing was held in a windowless room on the 3rd floor of a building with no sign on the door, for days of testimony in front of a panel of 3 officers who had already, before the first day began, formed a rough sketch of the conclusion they intended to reach. Elena sat through the first 2 days largely in silence, answering only what was asked, watching the panel construct their narrative piece by careful piece, watching them approach, and then deliberately walk past the scheduling error that would have complicated their story considerably. On the 3rd day, one of the panel members, a colonel named Whitfield with a reputation for thoroughness that did not extend to uncomfortable truths, asked her directly whether she believed the incident had resulted primarily from a failure of squadron leadership or a failure of external coordination. It was, in effect, an invitation. Whitfield had given her, without perhaps entirely realizing it, an opening wide enough to walk the entire scheduling failure through the front door of the record. Elena understood, sitting in that chair, exactly what was being offered to her, and exactly what it would cost the 2 young pilots whose names had already begun to circulate in hallway conversations, in the particular hushed, speculative tone reserved for people suspected of having done something they hadn't yet been cleared of. She thought of Marcus, 26 years old, still young enough to believe that reputations could be rebuilt cleanly, not yet understanding how rarely that was true. She thought of Daniel, meticulous to a fault, the kind of young man who would spend years quietly punishing himself over an error that was never his, regardless of what any hearing eventually concluded. She thought about how long it would take, months, most likely years, to fully untangle a scheduling failure spread across 3 separate offices, and how neither young man's career could afford to spend that time under the particular cloud that comes from being merely under investigation, a phrase that sticks to a name long after any formal finding has cleared it. I believe, Elena said, that the failure was one of squadron leadership. I was slow to authorize course correction. I take responsibility for the communication breakdown that put my pilots in that position. Whitfield frowned slightly, as though the answer had come too easily, but he did not push further. The remaining day of testimony followed the shape she had set, and by the 4th afternoon, the panel had exactly the narrative it needed, clean, contained, requiring no further investigation into scheduling offices that would have been considerably harder to hold accountable than a single colonel willing to accept the blame. It was not entirely a lie. She had been in command. She had, in some sense, been responsible for everyone under her. But it was not the truth either, not the whole of it, and everyone in that hearing room who understood the flight logs well enough to read between the lines knew it. Marcus and Daniel were young, and reputations at that age can be fragile things, easily shaped by the first story attached to a name. If the true tangled story had come out, the scheduling failure, the compounding errors from 3 different offices, 2 junior pilots who had simply followed the instructions they were given, it would have taken years to untangle, and both young men would have spent those years under a cloud of suspicion, regardless of what the investigation eventually concluded. People remember accusations. They rarely remember exonerations with the same clarity. Elena Voss ended her hearing with a formal resignation, effective immediately, and a permanent note in her record that would follow her for the rest of her working life. She never spoke publicly about what really happened. She never corrected the story. When Marcus and Daniel tried, separately, weeks later, to find her and ask why she had taken the fall for a mistake that was not fully hers, she was already gone, reassigned, then discharged, then simply absent from every list either of them had access to. They searched for a while, the way young men search for things they do not yet have the vocabulary to properly miss. They asked questions that got them nowhere. Eventually, the demands of their own careers pulled them forward, the way careers do, and the search quieted into something smaller, not forgotten, never quite forgotten, but folded away into the part of memory reserved for debts a person cannot figure out how to repay. Neither of them knew her real name. They had only ever known her by the call sign painted, in faded letters, on the side of an aircraft that had been decommissioned years ago. Viper 1. And somewhere in the years that followed, both young pilots, grown now into men who flew with steady hands and quiet, careful voices, had adopted, without ever quite discussing it with each other, a private habit. Before every mission, each of them silently acknowledged a debt they had never been able to pay, to a commander who had disappeared into the space between one hearing and the next, protecting them with a story that was not entirely true, at a cost that was entirely her own. What Marcus and Daniel never knew, in all their years of searching, was that Elena Voss had not disappeared into hiding so much as she had disappeared into an ordinary life, the kind of life that is nearly impossible to find precisely because it does not try to hide at all. She left the service with a modest pension, a permanent note in her file, and no clear idea of what a person who had spent 30 years thinking in terms of altitude and airspeed was supposed to do with the rest of her time on the ground. For the first several months, she did very little. She rented a small house outside a town most maps rendered as little more than a dot, and she spent her days doing the sort of unremarkable things that had never fit into a career built around split-second decisions. She learned to bake bread, badly at first, and then less badly. She read every book in the local library's small aviation history section, then started in on the fiction section out of simple curiosity about what else the world had to offer. She did not watch the news closely. She did not seek out information about her old squadron, though she thought about Marcus and Daniel more often than she would have admitted to anyone who asked, wondering, in the quiet hours before sleep, whether the story she had told in that windowless hearing room had actually protected them the way she'd intended, or whether she had simply traded one form of damage for another that she would never get to see. Eventually, she took a job teaching flight theory at a small regional aviation school, work that used her knowledge without requiring her to explain, in any detail, where that knowledge had come from. Her students knew her only as a former pilot with an unusually thorough understanding of formation flying and an even more unusual talent for explaining, patiently, exactly why a mistake had happened rather than simply that it had. She never told them her old call sign. She never told them about the hearing or the two young men she had once commanded, or the version of herself that had once been spoken of in hushed and reverent tones across an entire squadron of pilots who admired her without fully knowing her. It was, in its own way, a good life, quieter than the one she had left behind, smaller in the ways that mattered least and larger in the ways that mattered most. She made friends who had no idea what she had once been capable of in a cockpit, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that she did not mind being known that way, as simply Elena, a woman who taught flight theory and kept an unruly garden and read paperbacks with soft, worn spines. But some part of her, the part that had once broken radio protocol across 3 channels rather than watch a mistake become a tragedy, never fully set down the weight of what she had done in that hearing room. She thought, sometimes, about writing to Marcus and Daniel, tracking down whatever address or unit assignment might reach them, explaining everything in a letter that could say what she had never found a way to say in person. She drafted such letters more than once in the early years and never sent any of them, uncertain whether reopening the story would help the 2 young men move forward or simply drag them back into a version of events they had every reason to want to leave behind. The years passed the way years do, quickly in retrospect, slowly in the actual living of them. She grew older, her hair going gradually more silver, her hands losing none of their steadiness, even as the rest of her settled into the particular calm of a life lived well outside the spotlight. She kept, in the bottom drawer of an old dresser, a single photograph from her final year of active service, a group shot of her. Squadron, 6 young pilots and their commander, taken on a dry, sun-baked afternoon that none of them could have known, at the time, was one of the last easy days before everything changed. She looked at it occasionally, not often, but enough to remember that the debt she carried was not regret. Exactly. It was something closer to unfinished business, patient and quiet, waiting for a moment she could not have predicted and would not have dared to hope for. That moment arrived in the end in the most ordinary way possible, a scheduled flight, a paperback about a lighthouse keeper, and a routine trip home that turned 30,000 feet above the ground, into the closing chapter of a story she had carried unfinished for 15 quiet years. Back in the cabin of Flight 2291, the tension had not eased. The 2 jets held their positions, close enough that passengers could see the pilots' helmets turn occasionally to check formation, close enough that the low roar of their engines seemed to vibrate through the fuselage itself. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced calm, though even the most experienced among them could not fully hide the tightness in their shoulders. Elena Voss sat very still in 14A, the paperback closed now, resting on her knee. She had spent the last several minutes doing the kind of math she had once done instinctively, back when numbers like altitude and airspeed and formation spacing had been as natural to her as breathing. She watched the jets through the small oval window, and she recognized in the precise discipline of their formation the unmistakable fingerprints of a training lineage she had built with her own hands a long time ago, in a squadron that no longer officially existed. She did not know for certain who was flying those jets. She could not see their faces. But she knew, the way a person sometimes simply knows things about the world they have spent their whole life inside, that the odds were not as long as they should have been. The military was a small world at the top, careers braided together in ways that outsiders never saw. And if there was even a chance, even a small one, that the 2 pilots holding formation off her wingtips were men she had once commanded, men whose lives she had once made a very expensive decision to protect, then she owed them something she had never been able to give them in person, the truth. Or, failing that, at least an acknowledgement, a signal, a door left open, even slightly, even for a moment. She pressed the call button above her seat. A flight attendant appeared within moments, Her professional smile stretched thin over real fear, the kind of fear that made her hands slightly unsteady on the small notepad she carried out of habit rather than necessity. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" the flight attendant asked, glancing instinctively toward the window, toward the jets, as though the woman in 14A might somehow be able to answer the question everyone on the plane was silently asking. Elena looked up at her, calm in a way that seemed almost out of place given the circumstances, calm in the specific way of someone who has faced far worse than a tense formation flight and lived to read about lighthouses on the other side of it. "I need you to relay a message to the flight deck," Elena said. "It's important they pass it to the escort pilots directly on their frequency, word for word. Can you do that?" The flight attendant hesitated, glanced toward the cockpit door, then back at the quiet woman with the steady eyes. Something in Elena's manner, not urgency exactly, but a kind of absolute certainty, made the request feel less strange than it should have. "I can ask the captain," the flight attendant said. "What's the message?" Elena held her gaze for a moment, the paperback still resting closed on her knee, her hands folded over it now, steady as they had been steady for 30 years, through worse skies than this one. "Tell Viper 2, she said, I'm still here." 6 words. The flight attendant repeated them under her breath, twice, to be sure she had them exactly right, then hurried toward the cockpit, her footsteps quick and light against the low hum of the aircraft. Elena Voss turned back to the window. Outside, the jets held their formation, close and disciplined, the way she had once taught 2 young pilots to hold formation when the sky itself seemed to be testing whether they deserved to be in it. She did not know, could not know for certain, whether the message would land the way she hoped. She only knew that she had carried it, unspoken, for 15 years, and that if this was her last chance to say it, she was not going to let the moment pass in silence. In the cockpit of the commercial jet, the captain frowned at the strange request relayed to him by his flight attendant, but something about the woman's calm certainty, described secondhand, made him decide against dismissing it. He keyed his radio to the tactical frequency shared with the escort flight, a channel typically reserved for coordination, not passenger messages. "Hawk Flight, this is 2291. I have an unusual request from a passenger. She's asked that I relay a message directly to your formation. Message reads as follows." He paused, glancing at the note the flight attendant had scribbled, double-checking the words before he spoke them into open air. "Tell Viper 2, I'm still here. Over." For 3 full seconds, the tactical frequency carried nothing but static. In the cockpit of Hawk 1, Marcus Reyes felt something in his chest go very still, the way the air itself sometimes goes still in the half-second before weather breaks. He did not answer right away. He could not have answered right away even if he had tried, because his throat had closed around a response he did not yet have words for. Beside him and slightly behind in Hawk 2, Daniel Cho had gone equally silent, his hands frozen on the controls for the first time in his career during an active mission, his mind racing backward 15 years to a desert range, and a voice screaming an abort order that had saved his life and ended hers. Viper 2. It was not a call sign either of them had used in 15 years. It was not a call sign either of them had heard spoken aloud by anyone outside their own private, unspoken memory since the day their old commander disappeared from every list they had access to. It had been assigned to them jointly in the early weeks of that long-ago training exercise, back when Elena Voss, Viper 1, had still been alive to their world, still been the voice in their headsets they trusted more than their own instincts. Marcus Reyes had never told anyone, not even Daniel, that he still sometimes said the call sign quietly to himself before difficult missions, a small private ritual meant to remind him what discipline and sacrifice actually looked like. He had assumed, for 15 years, that the woman who had given him that reminder was somewhere out in the world, unreachable, uninterested in ever being found by 2 young pilots she had sacrificed her career to protect. He had never once imagined she might be 3 rows from the front of coach, on the very flight he was escorting home. "Hawk 1, do you copy?" The controller's voice cut through the silence, brisk and businesslike, unaware of the 15 years of history that had just detonated quietly inside 2 cockpits. Marcus swallowed hard, forced his voice into something steady enough to transmit. "Copy," he said. tighten formation. Request priority clearance on landing. Direct to gate, no delay. His voice cracked very slightly on the last word, a fracture so small that only someone who had known him for years would have caught it. Daniel's voice came through a moment later, equally controlled, equally unsteady, beneath the control. Hawk 2, concur. Requesting priority handling, effective immediately. The controller, sensing something beyond procedure in the pilot's tone, but unable to name it, granted the request without further question. Priority clearance. Direct approach. No delay. Inside the passenger cabin, nobody understood why the formation outside their windows suddenly tightened, why the two jets that had already seemed impossibly close drew even nearer, wingtips almost touching the fuselage, an honor formation that had nothing to do with security protocol and everything to do with two men who had just realized the debt they carried was still collectible, still owed, still capable of being repaid. The remainder of the flight passed in a strange, charged quiet. Passengers who had spent the last half hour frightened now found themselves simply confused, watching the two fighter jets hold an almost ceremonial formation off each wing, close enough to see individual rivets on the fuselage, close enough that the child near the front stopped crying and started waving instead, delighted by the sudden proximity of something that looked, to him, like the coolest thing he had ever seen. Elena Voss did not look out the window again. She sat with her hands folded over the closed paperback, her eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, the particular stillness of someone who has said the hardest thing she has to say and is now simply waiting to see what the world does with it. The descent began smoothly. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, steadier now, though still carrying a faint note of confusion he did not try very hard to hide. Folks, we've been cleared for immediate priority landing. Please remain seated with your belts fastened. We should be on the ground in about 15 minutes. Nobody asked why a routine escort had suddenly become a priority landing. Nobody had the language for the question. And even if they had, none of them would have received an answer that made sense outside the specific, private history shared by three people who had once flown together in a sky that no longer existed the way it used to. The man beside Elena, the one who had gripped his rosary through the worst of the scare, finally worked up the nerve to lean slightly toward her as the aircraft leveled out on its final approach. "Do you know what that was about?" he asked. "The jets. All of it." Elena considered the question for a moment. Turning it over the way she turned over most things now, carefully, without hurry. "An old debt," she said finally. "Somebody's finally paying it back." The man nodded slowly, clearly no more enlightened than before, but something in her tone seemed to settle him anyway, and he did not ask further. 2 rows up, the young father had given up on the tablet entirely, and was instead narrating the jets to his son in an excited whisper, turning fear into wonder the way children so often allow adults to do, if the adults are willing to follow their lead. The businesswoman behind Elena had reopened her laptop, though she was not typing. She was simply watching the gray shapes hold formation outside her window, aware, without knowing why, that she was witnessing something that mattered to somebody, even if she would never learn what. As the aircraft dropped through the lower layers of cloud, the 2 jets peeled away in a smooth, practiced maneuver, breaking formation only once the runway came into clear view, banking off toward a nearby military airstrip, where they would land separately, quickly, and then move, both of them, together, without a single word of discussion needed between them, toward the civilian terminal where Flight 2291 would be arriving. The commercial jet touched down with a gentle bump, tires screeching briefly against the tarmac before settling into a smooth taxi. The passengers, still uncertain what exactly had happened, began the familiar shuffle of gathering bags and standing too early, the ordinary chaos of landing reasserting itself over whatever strange thing had passed through the cabin 30,000 feet above the ground. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Priya, the flight attendant who had relayed the message, found herself glancing back at Elena more than once, unable to shake the sense that she had just been a small, unwitting part of something considerably larger than a routine flight. She had delivered thousands of messages between passengers and crew over the years, seating requests, dietary complaints, the occasional marriage proposal relayed nervously from one row to another. She had never delivered a message that made 2 military radio channels go silent for 3 full seconds. She did not know what the words meant, and some instinct told her she was not meant to know, but she found herself hoping, in the quiet way strangers sometimes hope for each other, that whatever debt those 6 words represented had finally been settled the way it deserved to be. The captain, too, lingered a moment longer than necessary in his announcement once they reached the gate, adding, almost as an afterthought, "And folks, whatever that was about, I think it's safe to say we were in very good company today." A ripple of uncertain laughter moved through the cabin. Relief, finding its way out through humor the way it often does once danger has clearly passed. Nobody understood the joke exactly, but everybody understood the relief behind it, and for a moment the entire aircraft exhaled together. 200 strangers bound briefly by an experience none of them would ever fully explain to the people waiting for them at baggage claim. Elena Voss did not rush. She waited until most of the aisle had cleared, the paperback tucked now into the outer pocket of her duffel bag, her sweater smoothed, her expression unreadable to anyone who did not already know her well enough to read it. When she finally stepped off the jet bridge into the terminal, she was not surprised, though something in her chest tightened all the same, to see 2 men in flight suits standing near the gate, still dressed for the cockpit, clearly having moved as fast as regulations would allow to reach this exact spot before she disappeared into the crowd the way she had disappeared 15 years earlier. Marcus Reyes and Daniel Cho stood side by side, older now than the last time she had seen them, the boyishness gone from their faces, replaced by the particular weathering that comes from years of difficult decisions made at high altitude. Neither of them had rehearsed anything to say. Both of them had spent the last 15 minutes trying and failing to prepare words adequate to the moment. Elena stopped a few feet away, the crowd of disembarking passengers flowing around the 3 of them like water around stones. "Colonel," Marcus said, his voice rough, using a rank she had not officially held in 15 years, using it anyway because it was the only word he had that felt true enough. "Not anymore," Elena said gently. "Just Elena, these days." Daniel stepped forward, his throat working around words that would not quite come, and then, without any planning, without any discussion, he did the only thing that felt adequate. He reached out and took her hand in both of his, the way a person holds something they were told, a long time ago, they might never get the chance to hold again. "We looked for you," he said, "for years. We never," he stopped, tried again. "We never knew why you took the fall. We knew it wasn't right. We knew it wasn't the whole story." "It didn't need to be the whole story," Elena said. "It needed to be a story you 2 could survive under. That's all it ever needed to be." Around them, other passengers from Flight 2291 slowed as they passed, curious about the small scene unfolding near the gate. 2 men in flight suits, clearly military, clearly emotional, standing with an older woman none of them recognized. A few pulled out phones, uncertain whether what they were witnessing was worth recording, uncertain what it even was. Word moved quickly through the terminal in the particular, half-accurate way that word always moves through crowded public spaces. Someone had heard the woman was a general. Someone else insisted she was a spy. A third version, whispered near the coffee kiosk, claimed she had personally stopped a hijacking before it started. None of the versions were true. All of them, in their own clumsy way, were reaching for something true underneath. Elena noticed the phones, the murmuring, the small crowd gathering at a polite distance, and something in her posture straightened slightly, an old instinct for composure under observation reasserting itself even now, even here, even for an audience that would never fully understand what it was looking at. Marcus's jaw tightened. The old anger and grief and gratitude tangled together in an expression that had taken him 15 years to learn how to hold without it breaking him. "You gave up your career for us," he said, "for a mistake that wasn't even yours." "I gave up a title," Elena corrected. "I didn't give up anything that mattered." She glanced between the 2 of them, seeing not the young, overconfident pilots she remembered, but the careful, capable men they had become, men who had clearly carried the weight of that long-ago morning with them through every mission since. "Looks like the sky turned you both into exactly what I always thought you could be. That was worth more to me than any title ever was." In the days that followed, small pieces of the old story began to surface, the way old stories sometimes do when enough time has passed, and enough people finally decide the truth is more useful than the silence that protected it. Daniel Cho, methodical as ever, spent an evening combing through archived records he had access to through his current rank. records that had been quietly declassified in the years since the original hearing, records nobody had thought to revisit because nobody outside a small circle had known there was anything left to find. What he found confirmed everything he had always suspected and never been able to prove. A scheduling failure traced through 3 separate offices, a communication breakdown that had put 2 young pilots on a collision course through no fault of their own, and a single unauthorized abort order that had prevented a catastrophic loss of life on the ground. The report, buried for 15 years under layers of bureaucratic caution, credited that abort order with saving an unknown number of lives. It made no mention of the deeper failures that had created the dangerous situation in the first place, because Elena Voss, in a closed hearing all those years ago, had made certain those failures were never fully examined. She had absorbed the blame instead, deliberately, precisely, the way a person steps in front of something dangerous, not because they enjoy the danger, but because they have calculated, faster than anyone else in the room, exactly what the cost of not stepping in front of it would be. Marcus requested a formal review. It was not a quick process, and it was not, in the end, a process that restored anything Elena particularly wanted restored. She had built a life outside the uniform, a quiet life that suited her better than she ever expected it to, and she had no real interest in reclaiming a rank she had walked away from with her eyes open. The review process itself took the better part of 5 months, moving through the particular slow machinery of institutions that are rarely eager to revisit their own past conclusions. Marcus attended 3 separate hearings, each one smaller and less contentious than the original had been, largely because the panel reviewing the case this time had no story of its own to protect. They were simply looking at documents, comparing dates, tracing a scheduling error through 3 offices with a thoroughness the original investigators had conveniently avoided. At the second hearing, a young records officer named Captain Alvarez, barely 30, spent an entire afternoon walking the panel through a spreadsheet of timestamps that traced the maintenance window shift back to its exact origin. A single scheduling clerk in a logistics office who had made an 11-minute adjustment without realizing, or perhaps without being told, how many lives that adjustment would briefly put at risk. The clerk in question had left the service years earlier and was never formally implicated in anything. The point of the hearing was not to assign new blame, but simply to establish, finally and clearly, that the blame had never belonged where it had been placed. Marcus sat through all 3 hearings with the same rigid posture he brought to every formal proceeding, but Daniel noticed each time the small ways his old wingman's composure cracked, a tightened jaw during the timestamp presentation, a long exhale when the panel formally acknowledged the abort order's role in preventing casualties. It was, Daniel understood, a different kind of flying for Marcus, one with no instruments to hide behind, no checklist to steady his hands. Just the slow, grinding process of watching an old wrong get measured, precisely, against the truth. What she did want, when Marcus finally asked her directly, sitting across from her at a small kitchen table in the modest house she had lived in for the better part of a decade, surprised him. "I want it in the record," she said. "Not for me. For the next person who's standing where I was standing, deciding whether to tell the simple story or the true one. I want there to be a record that shows what it costs and what it's worth, so they don't have to guess." The review, when it finally concluded months later, did not erase the original note in her file. It could not undo 15 years, and Elena had never asked it to. What it did was add context, the scheduling failure, the communication breakdown, the abort order that had prevented tragedy, and a formal acknowledgement that the officer who had accepted primary responsibility had done so, at least in significant part, to shield 2 younger pilots from a cloud of suspicion they had not deserved to carry. It was not a dramatic correction. There was no public ceremony, no headline, nothing that would have made sense to the 200 strangers who had shared a flight with a quiet woman reading a paperback about a lighthouse keeper. But within the small, specific world that mattered to the 3 people at the center of the story, it was enough. It was, in fact, everything. Daniel, in particular, found himself returning to the old report more often than he expected to. In the weeks after the review concluded, he had spent 15 years believing, in the quiet part of his mind he rarely examined too closely, that some fault of his own had contributed to that morning on the range, that if he had questioned the scheduling more carefully, or trusted his instruments a half-second sooner, the entire incident might never have happened at all. Reading the finished report, seeing in plain language the precise chain of failures that had actually caused the danger, did something for him that no promotion or commendation ever had. It let him put the weight down. He drove out to see Elena on a Sunday afternoon not long after, unannounced, and found her in the small garden behind her house, kneeling in the dirt with a pair of shears, cutting back a stubborn hedge that had grown wild over the summer. "I read the full report," he said, without preamble, standing at the edge of the garden with his hands in his pockets. Elena did not look up from the hedge. "I imagine it made for dry reading." "It made for necessary reading," Daniel said. "I spent 15 years thinking I'd miss something. Some warning sign. Something I should have caught before you had to catch it for us." Elena set down the shears and looked up at him, squinting slightly against the afternoon sun. "You didn't miss anything, Daniel. You did exactly what you were trained to do, exactly what you were ordered to do. The only thing either of you missed was information you were never given a chance to have." "I know that now," Daniel said. "I think some part of me needed to see it written down by someone who wasn't you, before I could actually believe it." Elena considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly, understanding something in the admission that went beyond the words themselves. The particular way guilt can outlive its own justification, the way a person can know a fact and still not feel it, until the fact finally arrives dressed in enough authority to override the feeling. "Good," she said simply. "Then it did what I hoped it would do." A year later, on a clear afternoon with a hard blue sky that reminded her, as it always did now, of the day two jets had held formation off her wingtips, Elena Voss stood on the tarmac of a small regional airfield, watching a single aircraft complete its final approach. Marcus Reyes had asked her to come, had been vague about why over the phone, only saying that there was something he wanted her to see, something that could not be explained properly except in person. Daniel stood beside her now, hands in his jacket pockets, a small, private smile on his face that told her he already knew what was coming and had decided, deliberately, to let his old commander be surprised by it. The aircraft touched down smoothly and taxied toward the small hangar where they stood waiting. When the canopy finally lifted and Marcus climbed down onto the tarmac, he was not alone in what he carried. Painted along the side of the aircraft's fuselage, fresh and careful, was a call sign that had not officially existed anywhere in 15 years. Viper 1. Elena stood very still, the same particular stillness she had carried onto Flight 2291 a year earlier, and for a long moment, she did not trust herself to speak. "It's not official," Marcus said, walking toward her, his voice carrying the same rough warmth it had carried in the terminal a year before. "Command would never sign off on it. But it's my aircraft, and I can paint whatever I want on the side of it, as long as it doesn't interfere with the actual markings." "You didn't have to do that," Elena said, her voice unsteady in a way she rarely allowed it to be. "No," Daniel said, stepping up beside them. "We didn't. We wanted to." Elena reached out and touched the freshly painted letters, the paint still faintly tacky beneath her fingers, and something in her chest that had been carefully sealed for 15 years finally, quietly, came undone. "You were the best pilot either of us ever flew under," Marcus said. "We spent 15 years trying to figure out how to say thank you to someone we couldn't find. Turns out all it took was you finding us instead." Elena Voss, who had once given up a career, a rank, and a name to protect two young pilots she had trained, looked at the two men standing in front of her now, capable, steady, exactly the kind of pilots she had always believed they could become, and she felt, for the first time in 15 years, that the story had finally caught up to its true ending. "Tell Viper 2, she said quietly, echoing the words that had once stunned two fighter pilots into silence 30,000 feet above the ground. "Thank you for finding me." Marcus smiled, the old debt between them finally fully settled. "Viper 2 copies," he said, loud and clear. Above them, the sky stretched wide and blue and entirely ordinary, the way skies do on days that matter most, indifferent to the small, enormous things that happen beneath them. But for the three people standing on that tarmac, it was not ordinary at all. It was a sky they had once shared, the sky that had nearly cost them everything, and the sky that had, in the end, given them exactly enough time to say what needed to be said. Elena Voss did not fly commercial again for the better part of a year, not out of fear, but simply because there was no reason to. Her life had settled back into its familiar rhythms: the flight theory classes, the unruly garden, the paperbacks with soft, worn spines lining the shelves of the small house outside the town most maps barely noticed. But something in her had changed quietly, in the way that only the people closest to a person can usually detect. She smiled more easily. She spoke, when asked, a little more freely about the years she had once kept carefully sealed away, though she never told the full story to anyone who did not already know most of it. Marcus and Daniel visited when their schedules allowed, which was more often than any of the three of them would have predicted a year earlier. They brought their own students sometimes, young pilots still early enough in their careers to believe, the way Marcus and Daniel once had, that the sky belonged only to the bold. Elena would sit at the head of her kitchen table, pour coffee into mismatched mugs, and tell them, carefully, selectively, the way a person tells a story they have finally made peace with about a training exercise that had gone wrong 15 years ago, and the 11 seconds that had mattered more than almost any other 11 seconds in her life. She never told them it was a story about heroism. She told them, instead, that it was a story about what a person owes the people they are responsible for, and what it sometimes costs to pay that debt in full. The young pilots listened the way young pilots always listen to stories like that, half convinced it could never happen to them, half aware, somewhere beneath the surface, that it absolutely could. On the anniversary of the flight, a year to the day after a quiet woman in seat 14A had pressed a call button and spoken 6 words that stunned 2 fighter pilots into silence, Marcus flew low over the small house outside the small town, a single pass, high enough to be legal, low enough to be unmistakable. Elena stepped out into her garden at the sound of the engine, shielded her eyes against the afternoon sun, and watched the aircraft bank once gently, before continuing on toward wherever its actual mission was taking it that day. She did not know and never asked whether the pass had been sanctioned or simply borrowed from a flight plan that happened to pass near enough to make the detour possible. It did not matter. She understood the gesture for exactly what it was, not an apology, because none was owed anymore, and not quite a thank you, because the words for that had already been spoken clearly on a tarmac a year before. It was, instead, something closer to an acknowledgement between people who had once flown together in a sky that had nearly taken everything from all three of them, and had, in the end, given something back instead. That evening, Daniel called, as he did most weeks now, and the three of them spoke for a while about nothing in particular. A student of Elena's, who had just soloed for the first time, a new posting Daniel was considering, the unreasonable heat that had settled over the region for the better part of a month. It was, on its surface, an ordinary conversation between old friends, and that ordinariness was, to all three of them, the quiet and considerable point of it. They had spent 15 years with a debt suspended between them, unspeakable and unresolved, and now they had years of ordinary conversations instead, stretching ahead in a way none of them had let themselves imagine while the debt was still outstanding. Before hanging up, Marcus asked, half joking, whether Elena had any interest in coming up for a proper flight sometime. Nothing operational, just an old training aircraft he had access to on weekends. Enough runway to remember what the stick felt like in her hands again. Elena considered it longer than either of them expected her to. Maybe, she said finally. Ask me again in the spring. I will, Marcus said, and both of them understood, without needing to say so, that he meant it, and that she would very likely say yes when the time came. Elena watched the jet disappear into the hard blue distance, the same hard blue she had watched through a small oval window a year earlier, and she thought, as she often did now, about how strange and precise a thing memory could be, how a single call sign, unused for 15 years, could travel across a silent radio channel and land exactly where it needed to land, in exactly the ears that needed to hear it. She went back inside, put the kettle on, and picked up the same worn paperback she had been reading on that flight, the lighthouse keeper's story nearly finished now, the pages soft from handling. She read the final chapter slowly, in no particular hurry, the way a person reads something they have earned the right to finish at their own pace. The story ended, as she had somehow known it would, with the old keeper finally leaving his post after decades of tending a light meant to guide other people safely home, never once needing it for himself. She closed the book gently, set it on the small table beside her chair, and sat for a while in the quiet of her own kitchen, listening to the kettle begin its slow climb toward a boil, thinking about lights kept burning for other people, and about how long a person could carry something before finally, rightly, setting it down. Outside, the sky held nothing but ordinary blue, empty of jets, empty of urgency, holding no more significance than any other Tuesday afternoon. But somewhere above the clouds, in radio logs and flight records that would likely never be fully declassified, a small, permanent trace remained of 6 words spoken from Seat 14A, proof, if anyone ever went looking for it, that some debts, however long deferred, eventually find their way home. The end.